The moment Pauline Finley pushed open the door to the Harlan County Courthouse on that sweltering Tuesday morning in August of 1887, every head in the room turned. Not slowly, not casually, all at once, like a single creature startled from sleep. The air inside was thick with pipe smoke and resentment, and the 23 men packed into those wooden benches seemed to collectively hold their breath at the sight of her. She was the only woman at the water rights hearing. She had known she would be. She had dressed for battle anyway, a severe gray dress with a high collar, her dark hair pulled back with ruthless precision, a leather satchel under one arm that held 4 years of maps, surveying records, deed filings, and a letter from the territorial governor himself. She had crossed 200 miles of baked alkali flat to be here. She was not leaving without what she had come for. What she had not expected, what cracked something open inside her chest before she could stop it, was the one man in that room who stood up. Not politely, not performatively. He rose from the front bench the way a man rises when he means it, when old habit and genuine instinct move faster than thought. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with sun-darkened skin and dark eyes that found her face immediately. He held his hat in both hands. He did not look away. Every other man in that room stared at her like she was a problem that had walked in off the street. He looked at her like she was a person. Martin Norris. She would not learn his name for another 20 minutes. She would spend the following 6 weeks trying to forget it. Because by the time that hearing was over, everything had gone wrong in the worst possible way. She had stood at that podium and laid out her case with the precision of a lawyer and the desperation of a woman who had mortgaged her entire life on a parcel of land that needed water to survive. She had presented her deeds. She had cited territorial statute. She had been interrupted 11 times by a man named Gerald Krause, who owned the largest cattle operation in 3 counties, and who had, according to her evidence, been systematically and illegally diverting the water from Bitter Creek before it ever reached her property line. And when the hearing official, a pinch-faced man named Arlo Dent, who owed his appointment to Gerald Krause's political donations, had ruled against her on every single point, Pauline had stood very still and felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. That was when Martin Norris had done the second surprising thing. He had stood up again, this time from his seat among the other ranchers, the men who should have been celebrating the ruling, and said, in a voice that carried all the way to the back of the room, "I'd like the record to reflect that I do not support this decision, and I believe the evidence presented was deliberately and wrongly dismissed." Gerald Krause had turned in his seat and looked at Martin Norris like a man measuring an enemy. And Pauline Finley had looked at Martin Norris like a woman trying very hard not to place any hope in something she did not yet understand. It had started 4 years before that courthouse, in the spring of 1883, when Pauline was 26 years old and newly widowed in the most inconvenient way a woman could be, not with grief, but with debt. Her husband, James Finley, had been a dreamer of the particular Western variety, the kind who could look at 160 acres of dry New Mexico Territory scrubland and see paradise. He had filed the homestead claim, borrowed against it, borrowed against the loan, and then contracted fever during the winter of 1882 and died before spring could prove him right or wrong about the land. He had left Pauline with the deed, the debt, 3 mules, a broken-down windmill, and an absolute silence on what she was supposed to do next. What Pauline did was stay. This was the thing people who had not known her would later find most remarkable. She had grown up in St. Louis, educated, with a father who was a county surveyor and a mother who taught school. She could have gone home. She had a return ticket folded in her Bible for the first 6 months, and she looked at it every night before she blew out the lamp. But something in her, something that had more to do with stubbornness than sentimentality, refused to let James's dream die just because James had. She repaired the windmill herself, hiring a Mexican man named Esteban who lived 3 miles east and who taught her things about irrigation and soil, and the hidden language of the land that no formal education had covered. She planted kitchen crops, she raised chickens. She drove her mules to the nearest town, Galberos, once a month for supplies, and she ignored every person who looked at her with that particular blend of pity and incomprehension that a solitary woman on a homestead in the New Mexico territory tended to attract. She also began, in her second year, to study water. The land she held was viable. It could grow more than kitchen crops, could sustain cattle, could become something real, but only if Bitter Creek flowed as it was supposed to flow, which was east along the natural channel that cut through the northern third of her property from late March through early September. The first summer she owned the land, the creek had run adequately. The second summer it had barely trickled. The third summer it had arrived 2 weeks late and run at less than half its normal volume. That was when she began to track it upstream. What she found upstream methodically, on foot, over the course of 2 painstaking summers, with her father's surveying equipment, and a journal she filled with observations, measurements, and dates was a systematic diversion. Someone had built a series of earthen barriers and wooden sluice gates along the upper course of Bitter Creek, routing the water south through a series of artificial channels to feed the pastures of the Krause Ranch. It was not a small operation. It had been built over years, quietly, during dry seasons when the creek ran low and nobody was watching. It was also, under territorial law, completely illegal. Gerald Krause had no water rights to Bitter Creek. His land did not border the natural channel. He had simply taken the water because he had the men to take it and the political connections to ensure nobody important asked questions. Pauline Finley had spent 4 years becoming someone important enough to ask questions. She had written to the territorial governor's office. She had contacted the Bureau of Land Management. She had hired, at significant expense, a lawyer in Santa Fe named Howard Peabody who had agreed, after reviewing her evidence, that she had a legitimate case and that the Harlan County Water Rights hearing was the correct venue to bring it. She had taken the stage from Galberos to the county seat with her leather satchel and her gray dress and her 4 years of careful, meticulous, undeniable documentation, and she had walked into that courthouse expecting to win. She had not expected Gerald Krause to have already bought the outcome, and she had not expected Martin Norris. Martin Norris was 32 years old in the summer of 1887, and he had been ranching the Norris land along the eastern edge of Harlan County since he was 19, when his father had died and left him 400 acres, 2 good bulls, and approximately $600 in savings. He had built the Norris ranch himself, practically board by board, fence post by fence post, through every drought and hard winter and low beef price that the decade had thrown at him. He was not rich in the way Gerald Krause was rich. He was something more durable than rich. He was solvent, he was respected, and he was honest in the particular, uncompromising way that sometimes made other men uncomfortable. He had come to the water rights hearing because he also had concerns about Bitter Creek. His land did not depend on the creek, the way Pauline's did. He had a good well and 3 stock tanks, but the creek's diversion had affected the eastern pasture he used for summer grazing, and he had his own suspicions about what Krause had been doing upstream. He had not, until that morning, organized those suspicions into anything as rigorous as the evidence Pauline Finley laid before the hearing official. When she had walked in, he had stood because that was what his mother had raised him to do. He had stayed standing longer than was strictly necessary because something about the way she carried herself, that absolute refusal to acknowledge the weight of 23 pairs of hostile eyes, had arrested him completely. He had listened to her present her case with growing astonishment, and then with something that felt very close to outrage, as Arlo Dent interrupted and discounted and ultimately dismissed everything she said. The evidence was ironclad. Any honest reading of territorial water law supported her position. And Dent sat up there and waved it all away like she was reading him a grocery list. When Dent announced the ruling, Martin felt something snap in him. He did not plan to speak. He was aware, very clearly and in the moment he rose, that Gerald Krause was sitting 12 feet away and had a very long memory and a very short temper. He also knew that silence in the face of that kind of injustice was a thing he would carry for a long time, and he did not want to carry it. So he spoke. He said his piece into a room that had gone utterly silent, held Krause's gaze for 3 long seconds when the man turned to look at him, and then sat back down. He told himself that was the end of it. He told himself he had done what was right and that was sufficient. He also told himself not to look for her face when he finished speaking, which meant that was exactly what he did. She was looking at him with those dark eyes, and there was something in them. Not gratitude, not quite, something more complicated and more carefully guarded, that he found he could not look away from without effort. The hearing dispersed. Men filed out in clusters, several of them casting glances at Martin that ranged from confused to suspicious. Gerald Krause left without speaking to anyone, which was somehow worse than if he had made a scene. Pauline was still at the front of the room, repacking her satchel with the rigid, controlled movements of a woman keeping herself together through sheer discipline when Martin came up beside her. "Miss Finley," he said. "Mrs. Finley," she corrected without looking up. "Mrs. Finley, I apologize for what happened in there." "You didn't do it," she buckled the strap. "Arlo Dent did it. Gerald Krause did it." "I know." He turned his hat in his hands. "I wanted you to know that what you presented was sound. The evidence was sound. The law is on your side. The law being on my side and the ruling being in my favor appear to be 2 different things." She finally looked up, and he saw the exhaustion behind the composure, the kind that came not from 1 hard day but from 4 hard years. "Thank you for what you said. It won't change anything, but it was kind." "It wasn't kindness," he said. "It was accuracy. There's a difference." He paused. "What will you do now?" She looked at him for a long moment. "I'm going to appeal to the territorial court. I'm going to write to my lawyer in Santa Fe tonight, and I'm going to file within the week. It will take time and money I can barely spare, but the evidence is what it is, and I am not going to let Gerald Krause steal my water and my livelihood because he paid the right man to look away." "I believe you," Martin said, and then, because he was not a man who did things by half measures once he had decided, "I'd like to help if you'll let me. I have my own observations of Krause's diversion operation. I've been upstream myself, not as systematically as you, but I have notes, and my testimony carries some weight in this county." She studied him with that careful, measuring look that he would come to know very well over the following months. "Why would you do that? You don't know me." "No," he said, "but I know right from wrong, and I know what I saw upstream, and I know that what happened in that room today was neither of those things." He held out his hand. "Martin Norris. I run the Norris Ranch, eastern end of the county. My land borders the eastern pasture about 3 miles from your northern fence line, I believe." She shook his hand. Her grip was firm and her palm was calloused, and her eyes up close were the particular dark brown that sometimes catches amber when the light hits it right. "Pauline Finley," she said, "and I don't need your help." "I know you don't," he said. "I'm offering it anyway." She let go of his hand. "I'll think about it." She did not look like a woman who would think about it. She looked like a woman who had already decided. But he was perceptive enough to know that the deciding was her business, and he had the patience to wait. He waited 3 days. On the 3rd day after the hearing, a Thursday morning with a sky the color of hammered copper, Pauline arrived at the Norris Ranch on horseback. She rode a brown mare that was working harder than it should have had to in the heat, and she dismounted with the efficient movements of someone who had learned to ride out of necessity rather than pleasure. Martin was at the fence line when she came up the lane, working a stretch of barbed wire that had pulled loose from the post. He saw her coming from half a mile out and felt something shift in his chest that he did not examine too closely. He set down his pliers and walked to meet her. "Thought about it," Pauline said without preamble, and I will accept your offer of testimony and whatever notes you have. In exchange, I'll share my complete documentation with you, and if your appeal to the county is ever necessary, I'll testify on your behalf as well." She reached into her satchel and produced a document. "I've had this drawn up. It's an agreement for mutual cooperation in the matter of Bitter Creek water rights. I'd like you to sign it." He took the document and read it. It was precise, clear, and fair. "You wrote this yourself. My father was a county surveyor. He taught me to think in legal language before I could ride a horse." Martin looked up from the paper. "You're remarkable," he said, and he said it so simply and directly that she blinked, as if she had been prepared for condescension or skepticism and did not quite know what to do with honest acknowledgement. "I'm practical," she said. "Both," he said. He signed the document without further negotiation because the terms were fair and because he had already decided he was going to help her, and the paperwork was secondary to that decision. They went inside to the kitchen table with her maps and his notes, and they worked for 4 hours that first day, cross-referencing her survey data with his observational records, and the picture that emerged was even clearer than either of them had assembled independently. Martin had measured the artificial channels from the upstream side. Pauline had measured the flow reduction from the downstream side. Together, they had a complete accounting of exactly how much water Krause had stolen, from when, and by what means. By midday, the kitchen table was covered in paper, and they had long since stopped being formal with each other, slipping into the shorthand of people absorbed in a shared problem, cutting sentences off at the point where the other person's understanding completed them. "Look at this date," Pauline said, leaning over the table and pointing at one of his entries. Her shoulder was 4 inches from his. He was very aware of those 4 inches. "You recorded this channel being fresh in April of 1885. That's 2 months before the flow at my end dropped significantly. So they built it in early spring when the snowmelt was high enough that a reduction wouldn't be noticed immediately downstream." Exactly. They were careful. This wasn't an accident or an informal diversion. This was planned and executed by someone who understood hydrology. She looked up and found him looking at her instead of the map. "What?" "Nothing," he said. "I was thinking." "About the case." "About the case," he agreed. This was technically true. He asked her to stay for the noon meal and she declined. He asked more carefully if she would come back in 2 days to continue reviewing the materials. She considered this for a moment that felt longer than it was and said yes. She came back, and then she came back again. Over the following 3 weeks, the rhythm of their collaboration settled into something that had the shape of a regular thing. Twice a week, Thursday and Saturday, at the kitchen table with the maps and the journals and the territorial law books Martin had sent away to Santa Fe for. And then after the work was done, the conversation that neither of them exactly planned but that always happened anyway. She told him about James, not the grief, she was careful about that, measuring out only what seemed relevant, but about the land, about the decision to stay, about the 4 years of building something from the structure of someone else's dream. He told her about his father, not the loss, though it was there in the way he described the early years, but about the ranch, the way he had learned it from the inside out, made it his own, the particular satisfaction of a piece of land that responded to the care you gave it. "Do you think of selling?" she asked one afternoon. Outside the window, a late summer thunderstorm was building on the western horizon, the kind that promised more lightning than rain. "No," he said. "Do you?" "Every winter." She said it without embarrassment. When the wind comes and the repairs cost more than the income and the nearest neighbor is 7 miles away and the isolation is, she stopped. "No. I don't really think of selling. I think about what it would mean to stop fighting, and then I decide not to stop." "That's the same thing I do," he said. They looked at each other, and something passed between them that was too substantial to ignore and too fragile just then to name. He asked her, on the 4th Saturday in September, if she would stay for supper. She stayed for supper, and they ate the meal he had made, a straightforward stew with biscuits, the food of a man who knew how to cook out of necessity. And she washed the dishes because it would have felt strange not to, and he dried them and put them away, and the domesticity of it was so comfortable and so alarming that they were both very careful not to acknowledge it. She rode home in the early dark, and he watched her go from the porch. And he stood there long after the sound of her horse had faded, knowing something was happening that he had not planned for, and that was not, perhaps, entirely wise given the circumstances. The circumstances being, she was involved in a legal dispute that was consuming her every resource and attention. She was still technically in the identity of a widow, which carried specific social weights in 1887. She was fiercely independent in a way that was not performance but genuine structure. She had built that independence necessity by necessity, and she did not lean on people. And he was a man she had known for less than a month, who had done one decent thing in a courthouse, and was now in danger of reading far too much into the fact that she laughed at his observations about the cattle market in a way she didn't seem to laugh at much else. He was also aware, not without some discomfort, that Gerald Krause would not be inactive. He discovered how inactive Krause was being in early October when he rode into Galbero's for supplies and stopped at the hardware store and found the owner, a man named Peters, unwilling to meet his eye. "Peters," Martin said, "I need to place an order for wire." "Can't fill it," Peters said. "Sorry, Martin." Martin set his hands on the counter. "Can't or won't." Peters looked up, and there was something in his face that was not quite guilt, but was very close to it. The expression of a man who has been placed in an impossible position by someone with more power than he has. "Krause's men came in," he said quietly. "Word is you're to be extended no credit and no service until further notice." Martin was silent for a moment. "On what grounds?" No grounds were given. Peters looked genuinely miserable. "Martin, I'm sorry if I push back against Krause in this county." "I understand," Martin said, because he did, and because he was not going to punish Peters for the corner Gerald Krause had backed him into. He picked up his hat from the counter. "Thank you for telling me plainly." He was outside and mounted before he let himself fully process it. Krause was moving against him. Of course he was. Martin had stood up in that courtroom and sided with the opposition and signed a legal cooperation agreement, and whatever spies Krause had in the county, and in this county there were several, would have reported all of it by now. He rode to Pauline's land. He had not been there before. Their meetings had always been at his place, by unspoken mutual arrangement, because his kitchen table was larger and his property was marginally more central. The road to her homestead was rough and wound through a dry arroyo that must have been impassable in spring. The homestead itself stopped him. It was small, a single-room house with a lean-to added on one side, a solid-looking barn that was clearly newer than the house, a kitchen garden behind a low fence, 4 chickens in an enclosure by the barn. Every part of it was neat and functional, and had the particular character of things made to last rather than to impress. The windmill stood at the western edge, turning in the October breeze with a slow, steady confidence. She was in the garden when he rode up. She stood and shaded her eyes against the afternoon light. "Martin," she said, and something in the way she said his name, no hesitation, no extra syllable of surprise, told him she was genuinely glad to see him, even if she would not say so directly. "Krause is moving against me in town," he told her, dismounting and tying his horse to the fence post. He told her about Peters, about the credit and service blacklist, and watched her face go through a rapid internal sequence of reactions that she kept very controlled. "I'm sorry," she said. "That's because of me, because you signed the cooperation agreement. That's because of Gerald Krause," he said. "Don't take responsibility for what he does. I brought you into this. I walked in." "There's a difference." He looked at her steadily. "I knew there would be a cost. I chose to pay it. That's not your burden to carry." She was quiet for a long moment. The wind moved through the garden and the chickens made their soft domestic sounds. "You should know," she said finally, "that my lawyer sent word from Santa Fe. The territorial appeal has been accepted and a hearing date has been set for January. But he also says that Krause has retained Emmett Bale." She paused to let that land. Martin knew the name. Emmett Bale was the most effective and most ruthless attorney in the New Mexico territory, A man who had won cases that had no business being won by finding procedural angles that lesser lawyers never saw. He charged accordingly. That Krause was willing to spend that kind of money on a water rights case said something very clear about how seriously he was taking the threat. "Your lawyer," Martin said. "How good is he?" "Howard Peabody is honest and thorough," Pauline said. "He is not Emmett Bale." Martin looked out at the windmill, turning its slow turns. "What would you need, in terms of additional evidence, additional testimony?" "The strongest possible testimony would be from someone with standing in the county, someone whose reputation the court would give significant weight to." She looked at him directly. "You know that's you." "Yes," he said, "I know. Krause will not stop with the hardware store. If you testify at the territorial level against him, he will find ways to make your life here genuinely difficult." "I know that too." "Then why? Because you're right," he said simply, "and he's wrong. And in the long run, the kind of county you live in matters more than whatever he can do to my supply lines." He turned from the windmill to look at her. "And because I'm not willing to stand aside and watch someone take something from you that you've worked this hard for. That's the truth of it. I'd rather you heard it plainly." Pauline Finley had spent 4 years not being moved by things. It was a survival strategy as much as a temperament. She had been moved over the course of those years by the land, occasionally by the sky, once by a letter from her mother that arrived 6 months late. She was moved now, standing in her kitchen garden in October with the autumn light going gold around her, by the plain and uncalculated honesty of what Martin Norris had just said. She did not say anything immediately, because what she felt was large enough that she wanted to be careful with it. "I'll make coffee," she said. They sat on the step of her lean-to as the afternoon cooled, and he told her about his mother who had died when he was 15, and she told him about her father's maps, the ones he had made of St. Louis County that she had grown up poring over, the way a map made the world legible, and that was a kind of power she had always wanted to have. He stayed until the sun was well down and the stars were coming out, and then he rode home under that enormous New Mexico sky, and he was aware, very precisely and without any capacity for self-deception, that he was falling in love with Pauline Finley. He was also aware that the timing was complicated, the circumstances were adversarial, and she was a woman who had very good reasons to be careful about where she placed her trust, and that the careful thing, the respectful thing was to let whatever was between them find its own pace while the legal matter was resolved. He intended to do the careful thing. He more or less managed it. October deepened into November. Martin managed his supply problem by riding the extra miles to the next county for what he needed, and by the practical expedient of having his friend and neighbor Cal Dumont, whose name Krause had not thought to blacklist yet, order things on his behalf. It was inconvenient. It was not catastrophic. He treated it as a logistical problem to be solved rather than a grievance to be nursed, because the latter was Krause's game, and he had no interest in playing it. He and Pauline continued their Thursday and Saturday work sessions, gradually shifting from pure documentation review to formal preparation of testimony. Howard Peabody came out from Santa Fe for 3 days in November and worked with both of them at the kitchen table, and Martin watched the lawyer's expression shift from cautious to genuinely optimistic as he went through their combined evidence. "This is exceptional," Peabody said on the second evening, tapping the stack of documents. "The diversion records alone would be sufficient, but with the survey data and both witnesses, this is the kind of case that wins." He paused. "Bale will try to challenge the procedural standing of the original complaint. He'll argue that Mrs. Finley's homestead claim has deficiencies. He will likely attempt to introduce evidence that the flow reduction was natural rather than artificial." "Can he make that argument stick?" Martin asked. "With a different judge, possibly. The territorial court judge for this circuit is Harmon Fairweather. He's not in anyone's pocket that I know of, and he tends to follow the law where it points rather than where he's directed." Peabody looked at Pauline. "You're in a strong position. I want you to know that. But Bale is very good, and you should be prepared for him to find an angle we haven't anticipated." "I'm always prepared for that," Pauline said. "I've been preparing for that for 4 years." After Peabody left, Martin found her standing at the window of his kitchen, looking out at the November dark. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Then I'm afraid." It cost her something to say that. He could hear it in the precision with which she said it, the careful control. "I know," he said. "If I lose this, if Bale finds something and the court rules against me, I lose the land. I can't service the debt without the water rights. I can't sustain the homestead without viable irrigation. 4 years of work and I lose everything James and I." She stopped. "I lose everything I've built." Martin crossed the kitchen and stood beside her at the window. He did not touch her. He stood close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, and he looked out at the same darkness she was looking at. "You're not going to lose," he said. "You can't promise that." "No," he said, "but I can tell you that the evidence is real and the law is clear and Judge Fairweather is an honest man, and that even in the worst outcome, you are not the same person you were when you arrived on that land. You know how to fight now. You know how to survive. That doesn't go away regardless of how January goes." She was quiet for a long moment. "Martin," she said. "Yes. Why did you stand up? In the hearing, you could have sat there like all the rest of them." He considered the question honestly, because she deserved an honest answer. "I stood up because you walked into a room full of people who had already decided you didn't belong there, and you walked in anyway. And I thought," he paused, "I thought that at the very least, one person in that room should make clear that they saw that they understood what it cost." She turned from the window and looked at him, and he was close enough now to see that her eyes were bright with something she was holding carefully in check. "I need to ride home," she said. "I know." "Martin," she stopped, started again. "I am very glad you were in that room." "So am I," he said. "I am so glad I was in that room." She rode home in the November dark, and Martin stood on his porch long after the sound of her horse had gone, and the stars were very bright, and the air was very cold, and he felt overall that his life had shifted on its axis in ways that were terrifying and wonderful in equal measure. November became December, which brought with it 3 separate attempts by Gerald Krause to complicate matters. The first was a formal challenge to the appeal filing, which Peabody countered without difficulty. The second was a rumor, circulated through Galbarro's and the neighboring settlements, that Pauline Finley's original homestead claim had fraudulent elements, that she had not made the required improvements within the required period, that the deed itself had irregularities. Martin heard this rumor from 3 different people in the space of 1 week. Each time, he said quietly and clearly that he had inspected the Finley homestead personally and found it to be meticulously maintained, and that anyone who believed otherwise was free to ride out and see for themselves. 2 of those 3 people did ride out. They came back with the kind of embarrassed expressions that meant they had found exactly what Martin said they would find, and the rumor lost most of its momentum. The third complication was more direct. One December evening, a man named Chet Raleigh rode out to Martin's property. Raleigh worked for Krause as a kind of general enforcer, not violent precisely, but radiating the potential for it, and told Martin that Mr. Krause would like a conversation at his convenience. Martin looked at Raleigh for a long moment. "Tell Mr. Krause that if he has something to say to me, he can say it at the next county council meeting like a civilized person," he said. "I don't conduct business through intermediaries in the dark." Raleigh looked at him with flat, assessing eyes. "Mr. Krause thinks you've gotten yourself tangled up in something that isn't your concern." "Mr. Krause is mistaken," Martin said. "Good evening, Chet." He went inside and locked his door, not out of fear but out of a clear-eyed understanding that if Krause had decided to escalate, he needed to be prudent. He sat at his kitchen table that night and wrote a careful, detailed letter to Howard Peabody in Santa Fe, documenting Raleigh's visit. He also, for the first time, took his rifle down from the wall and cleaned it and put fresh ammunition in the case beside it. He kept it within reach for the following 2 weeks. Pauline, when he told her, was very quiet. "He's trying to frighten you away from the testimony," she said. "Yes." "Does it work?" "No," he said, simply and completely. She looked at him with those amber-brown eyes, and something in her face shifted, something that had been careful and measured and controlled for a very long time. "Martin," she said. "Yes." "I don't know how to." She stopped, tried again. "I have not allowed myself to." Another stop. He waited, because he understood that she was doing something very difficult. "I find," she said finally, choosing her words with the precision she gave to everything, "that you are the most important person in my life at this current moment, and I don't know what to do with that information, and I wanted to." She looked at him. "I wanted you to know." Martin set down the report he had been holding and looked at her across the kitchen table, across all the maps and depositions and evidence of 4 years of fighting. "Pauline," he said, "I have been in love with you since approximately the second Thursday in September." She made a sound that was almost a laugh and almost something else entirely. "That's very specific," she said. "You made a notation in the margin of one of your survey maps that said Kraus is a fool and I can prove it, and underlined it twice," he said. "I found it rather endearing." She did laugh then, genuinely, the laugh he had been trying and failing not to catalog all these months. The way it surprised her face, made her whole expression open up into something unguarded and brilliant. "This is terrible timing," she said. "I know. The hearing is in January and we are in the middle of a legal battle, and any personal development between us could complicate the testimony in ways bail might try to exploit. All of that is true. And yet," she said. "And yet," he agreed. She reached across the maps and documents and 4 years of evidence and put her hand over his, and they sat like that in the December kitchen while the stove ticked with heat, and it was the most significant moment either of them had experienced in a very long time. Christmas came quietly. Martin rode to the Finley homestead on Christmas morning with a package his sister in Santa Fe had sent, which contained a good wool shawl and a set of decent drawing pencils, which he gave to Pauline because they seemed more useful than whatever else he might have thought of. She gave him a book, surveying manual, new, which she had ordered from the territorial catalog 2 months ago, and which meant she had thought of giving it to him since October. And they ate the meal she had prepared, and it felt like something they had been doing for years. He kissed her for the first time on the walk back from the barn after checking on her mare. The sky was high and clear and cold, and they had been talking about the January hearing, and her voice had had that particular note of contained anxiety in it. And he stopped walking and she stopped walking, and he said her name and she turned, and he kissed her with the care and attention he gave to things that mattered. She kissed him back without hesitation. "Well," she said when they stopped. "Yes," he said. "I believe I have wanted to do that since the second Thursday in September as well," she said. "What stopped you?" "About 15 things, most of them practical." She looked at him with that now familiar expression, the one that was both guarded and luminous at once. "I don't know what I'm doing, Martin. I don't know how to. I have been alone here for 4 years and I have made myself sufficient, and I am not certain how to." "You don't have to figure out all of it tonight," he said. "We can figure it out as we go. You make it sound simple." "I'm not a complicated man," he said. "I know what I want. I want you to win your hearing. I want to see what you build on this land, and I want to be part of your life, whatever form that takes, for as long as you'll have me." He tucked a strand of hair back from her face. "The order of those things can be whatever order you need them to be." She leaned her forehead against his jaw for one moment, one small, private moment of something she almost never allowed herself, which was rest. "January," she said. "Let's get through January." "January," he agreed. The territorial court hearing convened in Santa Fe on the 15th of January, 1888. Pauline and Martin had arrived 2 days before, separately, staying at different boarding houses because it was 1887, and the appearance of propriety mattered in a legal proceeding, and they were both aware of it. Howard Peabody had met with them both the evening before to go through the final preparation. Emmett Bale was exactly what his reputation had led Martin to expect. Lean, impeccably dressed, with silver-gray hair and the eyes of a man who had spent his entire career identifying weakness and walking directly through it. He arrived at the courthouse with 3 assistants and a leather case that probably contained, Martin reflected, every possible avenue of procedural attack on their evidence. Judge Harmon Fairweather was a heavy-set man of about 60 with white sideburns and the patient, deliberate manner of someone who had been deciding difficult questions for a long time and had no intention of being rushed. He called the hearing to order with a single tap of his gavel and set about it with methodical efficiency. Bale's first move, as Peabody had predicted, was procedural. He challenged the standing of Pauline's original appeal on the grounds that the county hearing official had discretionary authority over water rights determinations. Peabody countered with the territorial statute that explicitly provided for appeals of such determinations to the territorial court. Fairweather sustained Peabody's position. Bale's second move was to challenge the validity of Pauline's survey evidence on the grounds that she was not a licensed surveyor. Peabody pointed out that the maps had been cross-referenced with records from the Bureau of Land Management, and that the methodology was sound regardless of the credentials of the person who had performed it. Fairweather allowed the maps into evidence. Then Bale did something none of them had anticipated. He produced a deed. It was, he said, a deed to a water easement on Bitter Creek, recorded in the Harlan County Deed Office in April of 1882, predating Pauline's homestead claim, conveying certain water rights on the upper creek to the Krause Ranch in perpetuity. The room went very still. Pauline sat absolutely rigid beside Peabody. Martin, in the witness gallery, watched her face and saw the impact of it. The way she absorbed the blow, searched for the angle, refused to collapse. Peabody requested a recess to examine the document. During the recess, Martin watched Pauline spread the deed across the table and study it with the intensity of someone looking for the flaw they know must be there. She found it in 11 minutes. "The notary seal," she said, keeping her voice very low. "Look at the notary seal. This seal uses the new territorial format. The new format wasn't adopted until 1884. If this deed was recorded in 1882, it would have used the old format." She looked up at Peabody. "It's a forgery." "It has to be. They backdated a deed and they made a mistake on the notary seal." Peabody looked at the seal. He looked at the comparison document Martin produced from his satchel, a genuine 1882 deed he had thought to bring, a land transfer in his own property's history, and the difference was immediately visible even to an untrained eye. "Oh my," Peabody said softly. They returned to the courtroom, and Peabody made the argument with quiet precision, producing the comparison document and explaining the discrepancy in the notary seal format. He requested that the court examine the deed register at Harlan County to determine when the document had actually been filed. Judge Fairweather looked at the 2 documents for a long time. Then he looked at Emmett Bale with an expression that was not quite accusatory but was certainly not neutral. Bale's face was, for the first time in the proceedings, something other than entirely composed. "I will be issuing a request for the Harlan County deed records," Fairweather said. "This hearing will recess for 30 days pending examination of those records." 30 days. 30 days of waiting that stretched like wire drawn too tight. Martin rode back to Harlan County with Pauline the day after the recess was announced, and they rode for the most part in silence because there was too much to say and the road required attention. And at a certain point, Pauline looked at him sideways and said, "She found the flaw. That was you. You brought that comparison deed." "You found the flaw," he said. "I just happened to have a document in the bag. You brought it because you anticipated he might try something like this." "I brought it because I believe in being prepared." She looked at him for another moment. "You are a remarkably useful person to have on your side." "I try," he said. "Martin." She stopped her horse and he stopped his. "If the court finds the deed fraudulent, when? When the court finds the deed fraudulent, what do you think will happen to Krause?" "Charges most likely, fraud at minimum, possibly conspiracy." He looked at her steadily. He will not be in a position to threaten you or interfere with your water rights again." She nodded, looking at the horizon. "And between you and me," she stopped. "Between us, what happens then?" "Whatever you want to happen," he said. "At whatever pace you want it to happen." She urged her horse forward. "Then I would like," she said in that careful, measured voice, "to talk about what that might look like after January. When this is finished." "I would like that very much," Martin said. The 30 days was 31 in the end. The territorial court's investigators rode to Harlan County and examined the deed register. What they found there was, in some ways, even more damaging to Gerald Krause than the forgery itself. They found evidence that Arlo Dent, the county hearing official, had facilitated the filing, that 2 Krause Ranch employees had signed as witnesses on the date in question without any such signing having taken place, and that the whole mechanism of the water diversion, the sluice gates, the earthen channels, the artificial rerouting of Bitter Creek, had been known to the county office from the beginning. Judge Fairweather reconvened the hearing on the 22nd of February, 1888, in a Santa Fe courtroom that was considerably fuller than the first session. Word had gotten around, as it tends to do in territories where legal decisions carry outsized consequences for the land. Pauline sat at the plaintiff's table. Martin sat in the witness gallery and watched her. She was wearing the same gray dress she had worn to the Harlan County hearing 6 months ago. She sat with the same rigid precision. She had the same leather satchel on the table in front of her, slightly more worn than before. She was the most determined person he had ever seen. Emmett Bale made a brief and formal statement acknowledging irregularities in the deed evidence and withdrew from representation of Gerald Krause, which was legal language for the situation having become toxic enough that even Emmett Bale's professional reputation had limits. Krause sat at the defense table with a new, considerably less expensive lawyer who looked like he would rather be anywhere else. Judge Fairweather read his decision in the careful, methodical voice of a man who has given considerable thought to every word. He found in Pauline's favor on every point. He ordered the restoration of full water rights to the Finley homestead property. He ordered the removal of all artificial diversion structures from Bitter Creek, at Krause's expense, within 90 days. He referred the matter of the fraudulent deed to the Territorial Attorney General for criminal prosecution. He referred the matter of Arlo Dent's conduct to the County Governance Authority for removal and prosecution. He also said something that was not strictly required of the decision, but which Fairweather, apparently, felt needed to be said. "This court notes," he said, looking directly at Pauline, "that the plaintiff assembled and presented a body of evidence that was thorough, precise, and legally sound. The dismissal of that evidence at the county level was improper and was the product of corrupt influence rather than legal analysis. This court takes a dim view of proceedings that discourage legitimate claimants from exercising their legal rights, and it is this court's intention that the outcome of this case serve as a clear indication that such improper conduct will not be sustained." He tapped his gavel. "Court is adjourned." For a moment, Pauline did not move. Martin watched her sit very still at the plaintiff's table, while Peabody was shaking her hand, and the room was buzzing around her. And then she stood, and she turned, and she found Martin in the gallery immediately, as if she had known exactly where he was the entire time, and whatever she had been holding together for 4 years, for 6 months, for the last 31 days, some of it let go in her face, just a little, just enough for him to see it. He made his way through the gallery to her, and when he reached her, he did not say anything because there were 20 people in the room, and what he wanted to say was not for 20 people. He just held out his hand and she took it. "It's over," she said. "The hard part is over," he said. "The good part is starting." She looked up at him, this woman who had stood alone in a courthouse full of hostile men and never flinched, and her face was brilliant and exhausted and open in a way he had only glimpsed before. "Yes," she said, "I believe it is." They celebrated that evening at the best restaurant in Santa Fe, the two of them and Peabody, who was in an excellent mood and who told stories about his legal career that grew more colorful as the meal progressed. Martin ordered wine, which was a thing he almost never did, and Pauline drank hers slowly and watched the candlelight and was, for the first time in as long as either of them could measure, simply present in the moment rather than braced for the next threat. After dinner, they walked along the plaza in the cold February dark, and Pauline put her arm through his, and Martin felt the weight of it, the simplicity, the rightness of it, and thought that this was what it felt like to be on the other side of a long fight with someone you loved. "I need to go back to the land," she said. "I need to see the creek running. I need to. There's so much to do. Once the diversion structures are removed, the flow will return, and I need to be ready with the irrigation channels and the spring planting." "I know," he said. "I want to help with that. You have your own ranch to run." "I do," he said, "and my ranch is 3 miles from your northern fence line. That's not very far." She slowed her pace. They had stopped in the shadow of a portal, out of the flow of the few people still moving along the plaza. "Martin," she said, "I need to ask you something directly." "Always," he said. "What do you want? Not for me. Not what you're willing to do or what you're offering. What do you actually want?" He looked at her in the soft light, this woman with her calloused hands and her surveying instincts and her underlined margins and her one brilliant, unguarded laugh. "I want to marry you," he said. "Not immediately, not before you're ready, but that's what I want." She was very quiet. "I have been married before," she said. I want to be clear that I am not looking for someone to take care of me. I have taken care of myself adequately and intend to continue doing so." "I know," he said. "I'm not looking for someone to take care of. I'm looking for a partner, someone to build something with. That's a different arrangement." "Yes," she said softly, "that is a different arrangement." "Is it one you could want?" Another silence, longer this time. "Yes," she said, "it is one I could want." He kissed her there on the Santa Fe Plaza in the February dark, slowly and without any of the caution he had been exercising for months, and she kissed him back the same way, and it tasted like 4 years of hard work and one very good ruling and the particular sweetness of something earned rather than given. They rode back to Harlan County 3 days later, and the spring that came after was the most hopeful season either of them had experienced in years. The diversion structures on Bitter Creek were dismantled by Krause's men over the course of March and April, under the supervision of a territorial official who came out to ensure compliance. Martin was there for much of it, and so was Pauline, standing on the bank of the creek with her journal, recording the dates and the scope of the removal with the same methodical precision she had brought to everything. On the day the last sluice gate was pulled, and the water ran full and clear through the channel that had been cut off for years, Pauline stood on the bank of Bitter Creek and watched it come. It came the way things come back after long denial, tentative at first, finding the old channel, remembering the shape of it, and then with more confidence, the sound of it building, and it ran east through the northern corner of her property, and she stood in it to her boot tops and did not care. And Martin stood beside her with his boots getting ruined and did not care either. And she laughed and he laughed and the creek ran on, cold and clear and utterly indifferent to the human drama it had occasioned. Simply doing what water does when the obstacles are finally removed. Gerald Krause was indicted on charges of fraud and conspiracy in April of 1888. Arlo Dent was removed from his position and faced separate charges. The legal proceedings against them both moved slowly, as such things did, but they moved, and the outcome was not in significant doubt. Krause sold a substantial portion of the ranch over the following year to fund his legal defense. The county power structure that had organized itself around his interests began, slowly and visibly, to reconfigure. Martin Norris asked Pauline Finley to marry him on a Saturday evening in May, in her kitchen garden, with the summer crops coming in and the windmill turning and the sound of Bitter Creek audible on the north wind, a sound that Pauline said she was never going to take entirely for granted. She said yes. She said it simply and directly, which was how she said everything, and then she said, "I want to keep my land separate in the deed, as a legal matter." I want the homestead to remain the Finley homestead." "Of course," he said, "and I want," she paused, "I want to keep doing the work, not just the domestic work. The land management, the irrigation, the planning, I want that to be mine." "It is yours," he said. "It always has been. I wouldn't have it any other way." She looked at him with that expression, the guarded, luminous one, and it had become, by now, genuinely unguarded. "You are, without question, the best decision I did not intend to make," she said. "Thank you," he said. "That's the kindest thing I've heard all year." They were married on the second Saturday of June, 1888, in Galbarros, in a small church with a minister who was serious and efficient, and a ceremony that was, at Pauline's specific request, brief and substantive with no unnecessary ornamentation. Howard Peabody rode out from Santa Fe. Esteban and his wife, Maria, were there from 3 miles east. Cal Dumont, Martin's neighbor and friend, stood up with him. A handful of county residents who had quietly respected both of them and had not been part of the Krause machine came to offer their respects. Pauline wore a dress she had made herself from the best cloth available in the county store, a deep blue that was not the practical gray of the courthouse but was still nothing like bridal frivolity, because that was not who she was. She wore her hair in a single braid pinned at the base of her neck with a silver pin that had been her mother's. Martin had cleaned up his good suit and could not keep his eyes off her. After the ceremony and a modest celebration dinner at the hotel dining room, they rode out together 2 horses, 2 saddle bags, toward the Norris ranch where they would stay for the week before returning to run both properties in the partnership arrangement they had worked out with the same careful precision they had brought to the legal documents months before. The first summer of their marriage was one of the happiest periods either of them had known, though neither said so in those exact words because neither was inclined to effusion. They worked. They worked hard and well, together and separately, moving between the 2 properties with the particular efficiency of people who have found a rhythm that suits them both. Pauline's irrigation channels were flowing. Her crops were better than any previous year. Martin's eastern pasture was recovering with the restored creek water, and the summer grazing was strong. In the evenings, they sat on one porch or the other and talked about everything and nothing, the way people do when they have found someone they are genuinely glad to talk to. And the stars came out over the New Mexico territory, and the creek ran on in the dark, and it was ordinary and extraordinary in equal measure. Gerald Krause's trial concluded in October of 1888 with a conviction on the fraud charges and a significant fine, along with the requirement to compensate Pauline for the losses she had documented during the years of the illegal diversion. The compensation was a sum she had not expected, calculated by the court with the help of her meticulous records, and it was enough to retire the remaining debt on the homestead and to fund the improvements she had been planning since before James had died. She did not allow herself to feel entirely triumphant about this. She felt satisfied, which was what she actually was, satisfied that the work had been done right and the truth had won because of the work, not by accident. She told Martin this, and he said that was exactly the right way to feel, and she suspected he had always known that about her, which was one of the many reasons she had come to love him in the specific, bone-deep way she now did. The winter of 1888 and 1889 was a hard one in the New Mexico territory, as most winters were, and Martin and Pauline moved between the 2 properties as need required, occasionally spending extended periods together at the Norris Ranch when the weather made the south road to the homestead impassable. During one of those extended periods in February, Pauline said one morning over breakfast, with the straightforward delivery she brought to all significant announcements, "I believe I'm expecting." Martin set down his coffee cup. He looked at her across the table, the same kitchen table where they had spread maps and built a case and fallen into the habit of each other. "Yes," he said. "The signs are consistent," she said. "I'll be more certain in another month, but I'm fairly certain now." He stood up from his chair and came around the table and put his arms around her from behind, carefully, and put his face against her hair, and she put her hands over his. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm surprised," she said. "I had not allowed myself to think very much about. I hadn't planned." She paused. "I'm very glad," she said. "I want you to know that I'm very glad." "So am I," he said. "So am I." She was, as she had suspected, expecting. And on a clear September morning in 1889, with Esteban's wife Maria serving as midwife and Martin pacing the length of the porch, with an intensity that Maria later said was going to wear a groove in the wood, Pauline delivered a healthy boy with dark hair, and the beginnings of the same assessing, observational eyes she brought to everything. Martin sat beside her afterward and held his son with the careful reverence of a man holding something irreplaceable, and Pauline lay back against the pillows with the particular exhausted satisfaction of having done something very hard and extremely well, and said, "He looks like he intends to examine everything." "He comes by it honestly," Martin said. "What do you want to call him?" she asked. Martin looked at the boy, who was looking back at him with that brand-new, bottomless attention. "Thomas," Martin said, "for your father." Pauline's father, the county surveyor, the man who had taught her to think in maps. She had not suggested it and would not have, but hearing it said, she felt it settle into the right shape. "Thomas," she said. "Yes, that's right." Thomas Norris was, from his earliest days, a child of enormous curiosity and relentless energy, which was entirely predictable given his parentage. He walked at 10 months and spoke full sentences by 18 months, and spent his toddler years following his mother through the irrigation channels, asking questions that were sometimes unanswerable and always worth taking seriously. Pauline returned to full work within 6 weeks of his birth, which scandalized some of the county's more traditional residents and amused Martin enormously. Maria from 3 miles east came to watch Thomas during the working hours, and he thrived under this arrangement, absorbing the quiet bilingual household Maria offered and adding Spanish to his language inventory, alongside English with the easy adaptability of the very young. The homestead was formally absorbed into a shared operation in 1890. Not legally, Pauline retained the deed in her own name as they had agreed, and she always would, but practically, with a set of improvements that connected the properties more efficiently and allowed Martin to graze cattle on the southern acres of her land during summer without the previous complicated back and forth. They built an additional room onto the Finley house to serve as Martin's office when he was working the southern end of the combined property, and Pauline converted a corner of the Norris Ranch kitchen into a working cartography station, where she continued the mapping project she had begun as a survival strategy, and which had become, over the years, something closer to a vocation. She made maps, not just of their own land, of the whole county, the water systems, the natural features, the changed and unchanging patterns of the landscape. She corresponded with the Bureau of Land Management. She had by 1891 been asked to contribute survey data to the territorial record in an official capacity, which made her, technically, an official territorial surveyor, the first woman to hold that designation in the New Mexico Territory. Martin told everyone he met he could not help it. Cal Dumont, his neighbor and oldest friend, came over for supper one evening and listened to Martin explain the significance of the designation for approximately 20 minutes, and then said, "Martin, I've known you 14 years, and you are the least boastful man I have ever met, except apparently on the subject of your wife, which I find entirely understandable and also a little funny." Martin accepted this observation with good humor. It was accurate. The year 1891 also brought a second child, this one a girl born in April with a set of lungs that made her preferences entirely clear from her first moment in the world. They called her Clara, for Martin's mother, who had died when he was 15 and who he had never quite stopped missing. Clara was as loud and demonstrative as Thomas was quiet and observational, and they complemented each other with the particular chemistry that siblings sometimes have, contentious and devoted in equal measure. By the time Clara was walking, the Norris household, which occupied both properties in a fluid, practical way that the county had long since stopped finding unusual, had the organized chaos of a thriving working life. The cattle, the crops, the irrigation, the cartographic work, Thomas's investigations into everything, Clara's opinions about everything, and Martin and Pauline at the center of it, moving with the ease of people who have found their counterpart. There were still hard seasons. The drought of 1893 hit the county hard, and though Bitter Creek ran low, it ran, and the irrigation infrastructure Pauline had built over the years gave them better resilience than most of their neighbors. There were cattle prices that fell and supply costs that rose, and the grinding administrative labor of maintaining 2 homestead claims and 1 livestock operation simultaneously. And there was a moment in the summer of 1892 when Pauline received a letter from a legal firm in Albuquerque representing the estate of Gerald Krause, who had died of a stroke earlier that year, informing her that a portion of his estate had been ordered by the court to be distributed in final satisfaction of the compensation judgment. It was a strange moment to read, not triumphant, not sad exactly. She sat at her mapping table with the letter in her hand and thought about 4 years alone on the land and the water that had run too thin and a courthouse full of hostile men and 1 man who had stood up. She brought the letter to Martin that evening. He read it. He put it down. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Finished," she said. "I feel finished, like the last thread is tied." "Is that good?" "It's good," she said. "It's entirely, completely good." He put his arm around her, and she leaned into it with the ease she had once so carefully withheld, the ease of a woman who had learned, slowly and on her own terms, that there was a kind of strength that allowed leaning, that the 2 things were not opposites. On the 10th anniversary of the Harlan County Water Rights hearing, August of 1897, Martin and Pauline rode out to the northern edge of her land together. It was a Tuesday, the same day of the week as the hearing. The sky was blue and immense. Bitter Creek ran at full flow through the channel, catching the light in a way that made it look like something they had invented. Thomas was 8 years old and had insisted on coming, not entirely sure why this anniversary mattered, but certain that it did. He rode his own small horse with a seriousness that made Martin's chest ache with pride. Clara, who was 6, had also insisted on coming, and she sat in front of Pauline on the saddle because she was still not entirely reliable on her own horse and knew it. "This is where it started?" Thomas asked, looking at the creek. "Part of it," Pauline said. "Before I was born." "Long before you were born," Martin said. "Tell me again," Thomas said, with the particular authority of a child who has heard a story many times and knows it is still being honored in the telling. Martin looked at Pauline over Thomas's head, and she looked back at him with those eyes amber brown, careful, luminous, entirely open. "Your mother walked into a room," Martin said, "full of people who had already decided she didn't matter, and she had 4 years of evidence in a satchel that proved otherwise." "And then what?" Thomas asked. "And then she made her case," Pauline said, "precisely and thoroughly, and one person in the room made it clear that he was listening." "That was you," Thomas told his father. "That was me," Martin agreed. "And then you fell in love," Thomas said, with 8-year-old straightforwardness about the mechanics of things. "Eventually," Pauline said. "And then they got married and had us," Clara contributed, from her position in the saddle, stating the conclusion as the most important part. "And then they got married and had you," Martin said. He reached across the space between the horses and took Pauline's hand, the hand that was calloused from 4 years of solitary work and 7 years of building something together, the hand that had signed the cooperation agreement and the appeal documents and the deeds and the territorial surveyor designation, and once, over a kitchen table covered in maps, had simply covered his. She held it the way she held everything, with attention, with intention, with the care of someone who understood value. The creek ran on, bright and cold and persistent, finding its channel as it always did, water moving through the landscape with the patience of something that knows it will arrive if the obstacles are cleared. "Come on, then," Pauline said, and she turned her horse south, back toward the homestead, back toward the garden and the windmill and the office full of maps and the kitchen where breakfast was waiting. "We have work to do." They rode south through the morning light, the four of them, across land that was fully and finally and irrevocably theirs, not just in deed but in the deeper sense, earned by years of refusing to leave, refusing to be silent, refusing to let what was true be overridden by what was convenient for people with more power and fewer scruples. The land knew them now, wore the mark of their years on it in the irrigation channels and the fence lines, and the cultivated fields, and the unbroken windmill turning in the clean August air. Martin rode beside Pauline and their children rode ahead, Thomas pointing out something on the horizon with that characteristic focused intensity, Clara arguing about it with equally characteristic certainty, and Martin looked at Pauline and Pauline looked at Martin, and between them passed the wordless fluency of people who have learned each other's language so thoroughly they sometimes forget there was ever a time they didn't speak it. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "That I am the luckiest man in the New Mexico territory," he said. "That is a very large claim. I stand by it." She smiled fully, the unguarded one. "So do I," she said. "So do I." And they rode home, through the morning that smelled of sage and water and worked earth, into the life they had built out of evidence and stubbornness and one decent act in a courthouse, and the slow, certain, world-altering fact of two people who had found each other and refused to let go. The water rights were hers. The land was theirs. The years ahead were wide and open as the territory sky, full of work and seasons and the ordinary extraordinary business of a life, shared with someone who sees you completely and stays anyway. In the courthouse square in Galberos, there was by 1897 a small printed notice in the territorial clerk's wind, a reproduction of the water rights ruling, posted by Judge Fairweather's office as a reference document for future cases of water diversion. Pauline had seen it once, walking past with Clara on her hip, and had stopped and read it and felt something she could only describe as rightness, the satisfaction of a thing having landed where it belonged. Her name was on it, Pauline Finley. The name she had kept, the name she had fought under, the name on the deed and the surveyor designation and the maps she made of the land. Martin Norris. Also on it, as witness and co-complainant in the appeal. Their names, side by side in the territorial record, which was a kind of permanence she had not expected and which mattered to her more than she knew how to say. She never needed to say it. He already knew. Thomas grew into a young man who studied law because the story of the water rights hearing was the first story he had ever known, and it had shaped the way he understood justice and evidence, and the obligation to speak when speaking was difficult. Clara grew into someone who could not be contained by any single description, and who did not, for a single moment, try. There were seasons of plenty and seasons of want, as there always are, and Martin and Pauline moved through them with the durable, tested love of people who have chosen each other not once in a ceremony but daily, in the practical and the difficult and the beautiful ordinary moments of a shared life. In 1899, Pauline finished a map of the entire Harlan County water system, the most comprehensive such document in the territorial record, and submitted it to the Bureau of Land Management. The acknowledgement letter she received called it invaluable and unprecedented, and a significant contribution to territorial resource management. She read it at breakfast and passed it to Martin and drank her coffee while he read it. "Invaluable and unprecedented," he said. "Yes," she said. "That's accurate," he said, and looked at her over the letter, and she looked back at him the way she had been looking at him for 12 years, with all the careful and luminous and ungovernable truth of it. Outside, the creek ran north to south through the channel it had always meant to run, and the windmill turned in the morning wind, and the New Mexico territory stretched out in all directions under a sky that held everything, the past and the present and the whole long, certain, hard-won future, equally and without judgment as the land always does. It was enough. It was everything. It was home.